All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever really thought about where the American idea of free thought, the freedom to believe what you want, actually comes from? The answer might really surprise you. It wasn't born out of some grand, enlightened plan. Turns out it was pretty much a series of historical accidents. So let's explore how it all went down.
So, picture this. Our story begins in a world run by absolute authority. A world where persecuting someone for having the wrong belief wasn't just acceptable, it was considered a sacred duty. The question is, how in the world did we get from that to our modern ideal of intellectual freedom? It's a real historical puzzle. And here it is, the core idea of this whole explainer. The revolution of the mind, this huge shift in thinking, it wasn't the result of some big, noble plan. Nope, it was largely an accident. An outcome created by people who, and this is the ironic part, were often fighting tooth and nail against the very freedoms they ended up creating.
So where does this incredible accidental journey even begin? Well, it starts with a shock to the system. A shock so profound, it literally changed the way people thought about everything.
For centuries, the European mind had been running in these deep, well-worn grooves. It was a world with known ideas, known limits. Then the discovery of America comes along and gives that mind, as one historian so perfectly put it, such a wrench out of its ancient grooves that it just shattered the old reality. It was a massive, collective, psychological jolt.
I mean, just try to imagine it for a second. All of a sudden, there are entire continents that weren't on any map. There are stars in the sky that no one in your world has ever seen before, animals and plants that defy every category you have. This wasn't just new data. It was a full-blown crisis for the old way of seeing the world. The old books and the ancient authorities, they had no answers for any of this. And that forced people to start thinking in completely new ways. We often give all the credit to the Renaissance for sparking modern thought, and yeah, it was hugely important for bringing back all that classical learning. But what the Age of Discovery did was something different, something maybe even more radical. It didn't just point back to the past, it proved, in the most dramatic way possible, that you could do brand new things. It showed that the world was way bigger, way more mysterious than anyone had ever dreamed, and that created this insatiable hunger for new knowledge, not just old wisdom.
So if the New World cracked open the mind, it was the religious conflicts back in the Old World that accidentally opened the door to tolerance. But, and this is key, this progress didn't come from some enlightened ideal. It was forged in the fire of really bitter struggles.
And here's the crucial thing to understand. Nobody in these conflicts was fighting for religious freedom as we think of it. Not even close. These guys weren't liberals. Most were just fighting to replace one rigid, unbending system of belief with their own rigid, unbending system of belief. But in the process of all that fighting, they unintentionally weakened the very idea that any one group could or should enforce its beliefs on everyone else. And this shows that process perfectly. First, you have the Reformation, which breaks the absolute top-down power of the Pope. Then you get groups like the Presbyterians, who challenge the authority of kings and bishops, moving power to larger committees or assemblies. And finally, you have the Independents, who take it even further, arguing that power should rest with each individual, self-governing church. You see the pattern? Each step was a revolt against the one before it, and each one decentralized the power to force belief just a little bit more. And believe me, this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. It had huge political consequences. King James I, he saw exactly where this was headed. He knew that a system where religious authority rests in a committee of elders, a presbytery, was completely at odds with the absolute authority of a king. He saw it, plain and simple, as a direct threat to his power. Now, while all this religious upheaval is happening in England, another force is starting to bubble up: commerce. The Dutch, who were the great merchants of the time, they figured out something pretty critical. Religious persecution is just plain bad for business. So they adopted a policy of broad toleration, not because they were big-hearted idealists, but because it was pragmatic. Their critics, of course, sneered and called the Netherlands a cage of unclean birds because every kind of so-called heretic was welcome there. But this commercial model of tolerance, it would end up being incredibly influential. And all of this brings us, finally, to the American colonies. They became this kind of amazing real-world laboratory, a place where all these different forces, religious dissent, business interests, new philosophies, could mix together and react in totally new and unexpected ways. What's so fascinating is that there wasn't just one reason for toleration in America. It happened all over the place, for all kinds of different reasons. In Maryland, it was a practical move to protect the Catholic minority. In Pennsylvania, it was a core part of Quaker philosophy about the individual. In New Netherland, which became New York, they just imported that practical Dutch business model. And then you have Rhode Island, which was something else entirely.
And that's where Roger Williams comes in. He's a truly pivotal figure. He got into this massive debate with the super powerful Puritan minister, John Cotton. Now, Cotton had the standard view for the time. It is our sacred duty to God to stamp out religious error. But Williams fired back with this revolutionary counterargument. He basically said, whoa, who are you to decide what's an error? To persecute someone for what they believe is to assume that you are infallible, that you literally can't be wrong. That was a profound, world-changing leap towards real individual liberty.
Which, of course, leads us to the biggest paradox of all. Roger Williams was kicked out of Massachusetts, right? The most rigidly intolerant, theocratic colony of them all. So how on earth did that very same place, Massachusetts, become the intellectual engine of American liberalism just a century later?
Well, the answer was hidden inside Puritanism itself. For all its strictness, it carried the seeds of its own transformation. First, Puritans ultimately believed in reason as the final judge. Second, they demanded universal education so that everyone could read the Bible for themselves. This created a population that was incredibly literate and skilled in critical debate. And finally, their own fanaticism, like the brutal persecution of the Quakers, eventually led to a huge public backlash against the ruling clergy.
The real tipping point came with a preacher named Jonathan Edwards. He was this brilliant, hardcore, old-school Calvinist. But his efforts to double down on the old ways completely backfired. His complex arguments sparked so much debate and disagreement that they ended up acting like a disintegrating solvent on the old beliefs, unintentionally paving the way for more liberal ideas like universalism and Unitarianism to emerge.
And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most powerful force in this whole story, the one thing that really makes the shift to free thought permanent: the rise of modern science.
See, the scientific revolution created a completely new way of understanding reality. The old world was based on static, unchanging authority. The new scientific world was a story of constantly expanding knowledge. Old beliefs, like witchcraft, for instance, they weren't just argued against anymore. They simply stopped fitting into the world as people now understood it. They just became obsolete.
And this really gets to the heart of it all, the ultimate takeaway from this whole journey. We've moved from a world that tried to use leashes, things like orthodoxy, coercion, authority, to restrain human thought, to a world that understands we actually need wings, curiosity, reason, open inquiry, to sustain our flight into the unknown future.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. This process of old, rigid beliefs fading away in the face of new knowledge, it didn't stop in the 19th century. It's still happening right now. Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What deeply held ideas that seem like just common sense to us today will look like a strange, outdated orthodoxy to the people of the future?